Coming up tonight, is there really the money for tax cuts? I'll ask the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt. The SNP's Westminster leader, Stephen Flynn, presumably knows where Nicola Sturgeon buried her WhatsApps. Anushka and Screeny have run the numbers on how much is in the Chancellor's kitty. The financial guru, Martin Lewis, fears the government isn't moving fast enough to protect consumers from taking on excessive buy now, pay later debts. And I'll ask Labour's Dawn Butler and the Conservative David Davis whether they're cheering or weeping that Labour won't reimpose the cap on bankers' bonuses. Watcher, let's start with a looming moment of history, which is the likelihood that on Saturday, Michelle O'Neill of Sinn Féin will become First Minister of Northern Ireland after the unionist DUP finally compromised on post-Brexit arrangements for trade between Great Britain and the province. For those of you too young to know or remember, Sinn Féin was the political wing of the terrorist IRA paramilitaries who waged war on the British government and killed countless civilians. That it now fills the top political job in Northern Ireland and is such an important democratic movement north and south of the Irish border is the most powerful proof that seemingly irreconcilable sectarian differences can be salved by the ballot box. And perhaps the UK's Foreign Secretary David Cameron had this in mind earlier this week when he came close to making a bit of history himself by saying that the UK would accelerate the country's formal recognition of a Palestinian state as part of a deal to bring permanent peace and stability to Israel, Gaza and the West Bank. Of course, the big lesson of the peace process in Northern Ireland is that it's the patient work of years. And if you're a civilian in Gaza, fearing your children may be killed at any moment, right now you may regard patience as an unaffordable, even lethal luxury. By comparison, the stuff our leaders think is important, how and how much to cut taxes, how and how much to invest in climate-friendly projects, may seem trivial. It isn't, of course. Every aspect of our credibility as a nation rests on our economic competence. But it's not life or death. Anushka.
Thank you. It has been a tricky few weeks for the Prime Minister, with lots of talk of backbench plots. He is trying to focus on the day job. Can he? Well, there is a lot going on, as Robert mentioned, escalating tensions in the Middle East, and today that big news on Northern Ireland. A deal agreed, but only after a lack of functioning government for a very long time. This is from Katie Hayward at Queen's University Belfast, and it compares it to other countries when they faced difficult times, like Iraq, which lost its functioning government for 289 days in 2010 and 382 in 21-22. Belgium has had two pretty significant periods over recent years, one of them above 650 days, but neither compare to Northern Ireland, well over 700 days over two periods, the latest one starting in 2022. So, sorting that out is a positive outcome the Prime Minister can point to. And meanwhile, he's been busy finding other subjects to talk about, confirming reports about his eating or lack of eating habits. He may well want to talk about tax cuts. I will come back to that. And he's been talking about his ban on disposable vapes and phasing out smoking, which is hugely popular with the public. This green bar shows overall support among everyone for this policy. Now, normally these things break down differently among political parties, but in this case, Conservative and Labour voters love the policy. But can a popular smoking ban turn things around for the PM? We know he is facing consistently terrible polls. How bad are they? Peter Kellner has helpfully analysed every poll in 2023, averaging the figures for each pollster. Overall, Labour has an 18% lead on average, and even the most optimistic pollster for the PM gives it a 13.5% lead, which would still deliver a Labour majority.
Thanks very much, Anushka. We might come back to some of that later in the programme, but I want to start with you, Dawn. Until comparatively recently, there was a cap on bankers' bonuses of 200% of what they could earn. I think most people would love to be able to earn 200% of their salary in bonuses. That was introduced after the financial crisis, but the government has lifted the cap, abolished the cap, got advice from this on from the Bank of England. Rachel Reeves said something that I think many people were surprised by. She's your shadow chancellor, that Labour wouldn't reinstate the cap on bankers' bonuses. Was that a smart move by Rachel Reeves?
Well, first of all, I think it's interesting to see the government's priorities. Right?
What about your priorities? Sorry, I was asking about Labour's priorities.
I know, but I'm just saying it is interesting to see the government's priorities. And what Rachel has said is that they are not going to undo whatever the Tories are doing.
So what is the point of having a Labour government?
But hang on. But do I think personally it's a good idea to cap bankers' bonuses? Yes, I do. Do I think it's something that we need to come back to as a Labour Party and discuss? Yes, I do. We haven't discussed this as a parliamentary committee, and we haven't discussed why the decision has been made. And I think it's something that needs further investigation, because the priority shouldn't be... The banks have made a phenomenal amount of profit at a time when people are struggling to pay bills. So I think it's something that needs further discussion.
David, I might ask you about something slightly different. Anushka showed you one set of polls, a very interesting poll today from Ipsos about people's attitudes to Brexit. Now, it is 4 years since we left the European Union. Only 13% of British people think Brexit has been a success. Are you amazed as many as 13% think it's a success?
Well, I'm not amazed at the outcome, because you've had non-stop propaganda the other way. I mean, you think back to when we had these battles and people saying, oh, there's going to be 1 million unemployed. No, they're not. There are fewer unemployed. There's going to be no exports to Europe. Actually, exports have gone up by 14%. We're going to have terrible growth figures. We're doing better than Germany, Italy and France. So, on the one hand, you've heard all these arguments that things have gone terribly, but actually, have they? And today, as you've just seen, with the Northern Irish issue, the issue that I resigned over, remember, because the previous Prime Minister given away the game, has been recovered. So I think, we will see, it takes time, but we will see benefits and they'll show properly.
So I've never heard you, David, before saying the British people are wrong. But anyway, I'm going to go to Anushka for a couple of minutes. And...
Let's talk about difficult decisions facing the government with just 2 simple lines. I love a simple chart. This is from the Institute for Fiscal Studies this week. So the purple line on top is total government spending on things like NHS, education, police and so on. The green line is revenues raised by the government, mostly from tax. We actually have to go all the way back to the late 90s to find a surplus, revenues above spending. Since then, the gap has represented our deficit, surging after the financial crisis and then again during COVID. Now, there are obviously 2 ways to close the gap: raise revenues or cut spending, which they did from 2010. This is the austerity period. Now, we still have a large gap, which is a headache for ministers, because right now spending demands are huge, but there's also lots of pressure on them to cut tax. Now, the only way to do that and not worsen the deficit is growth. But yesterday, the International Monetary Fund published some pretty low growth forecasts for the UK, second lowest to only Germany in the G7. And on the question of tax and spend, the IMF said preserving high-quality public services will imply a higher spending in the medium term than currently reflected in the government's budget plans. And so they advise against further tax cuts. Robert.
Thanks, Anushka. So it won't surprise you that a little earlier on today, when I chatted with the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, I asked him about whether or not he can afford to cut taxes in the way that he and the Prime Minister have been signalling that they wanted to do. And I asked him whether he told the Cabinet not to expect as big tax cuts as his Tory colleagues may be hoping for.
Well, Robert, we go through a process ahead of every budget and autumn statement where you don't actually know the final numbers until a couple of weeks before, and we're still in the middle of that process. As things stand at the moment, things can change. It doesn't look like I'll have the kind of room that I had for those very big tax cuts in the autumn, and I did mention that to the Cabinet, yes.
And with a smaller pot, is your very strong sort of instinct, priority, that you do want to deliver tax cuts?
Well, and I'm not just saying this for the sake of a media interview. I can absolutely tell you truthfully, no decisions have been made. The Prime Minister and I are in the very early stages of our discussions on these topics. So perhaps the best answer I can give you is what our direction of travel will be, what our priorities will be. If I give you one example, the national insurance cut that I introduced in the autumn statement, because that increases the incentives for people to go into work and people work longer hours, it will do the equivalent of filling around 1 in 10 vacancies in the economy. So it's not just good in terms of people having more money to spend, it actually helps grow the economy. And those kind of tax cuts, where they're responsible, where you're not increasing borrowing to pay for them, can be very, very important to our long-term prospects.
And I suppose the reason I wondered about your personal commitment to tax cuts is you will have seen the International Monetary Fund, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, even your own Office for Budget Responsibility, saying that what you've penciled in for rises for public services in coming years is simply inadequate, and that therefore the priority ought to be public spending rather than tax cuts. Are these experts just wrong?
They're not wrong, but what they're saying is based on our growth rate continuing at a low level, and what I'm saying is the solution, the way we get more funding into our public services, is to increase our growth rate, and that's exactly what I want to do. Indeed, the OBR recognised that in their analysis of the autumn statement. They said that the changes that I made in the autumn statement and the spring budget before it would increase GDP by 0.5%. That means more tax receipts for our schools and hospitals and other public services.
You were the Chancellor brought in after the debacle, the recklessness of the Truss Kwarteng mini-budget. And as somebody who wants to bring back stability, you will know that you cannot, in the space of the months left before the general election, get the growth rate up. And that's why people would say, like the IMF, that your priority at this stage can't be to cut taxes, because their implication is inevitably you will be borrowing to pay for those tax cuts.
Well, Robert, the growth in the economy is 3% larger today than it was predicted to be at the time that I became Chancellor. And so we've taken some really difficult decisions. Decisions difficult for me as a Conservative, because sometimes it's involved reversing what my predecessors did or putting up taxes, things I don't want to do.
But on that 3% larger, that is history, though. What we're talking about is a growth
yes, I know,
rate
and I'm just about
going
to
forward,
answer your
which is
question.
too low.
I'm just about to answer your question.
Okay.
I don't control what the month-by-month GDP figures are, but where I can make the biggest difference is in our medium and longer-term prospects. And if you look at the progress we've made in this country since 2010, grown faster than Germany or Japan, created more than 800 jobs every day, just recently overtaken France to become the 8th largest manufacturing sector in the world, a technology sector by far the biggest in Europe. We have fantastic prospects as a country, but what we mustn't do is risk that progress on a spending spree, which is what I'm afraid Labour are advocating one way or another, whether it's exactly 28 billion, whether it's tomorrow or at the end of the Parliament. That's money they want to spend.
But what the IMF and IFS and the OBR are saying is they don't want a spending spree, but they just think public services require support, and they say you've got to give that support.
Well, you're looking at the person who negotiated as Health Secretary an increase in funding for the NHS of over £20 billion. And in the autumn statement a year and a half ago, when I took all those difficult decisions, I increased funding for the NHS. So hopefully my record in terms of protecting our vital public services speaks for itself.
Which at this time of instability will include defence. I mean...
Yeah, but Robert, here's the message that I really want to say about this. But it is, we have increased spending on the NHS since 2010 by nearly 40% in real terms. But it is not sustainable to keep on increasing spending without asking for more productive use of taxpayers' money. And I think there are huge efficiencies that the NHS, all our public services can make. So What a Conservative government will do is say, yes, we will provide the money that's necessary, but we need to see that money spent more productively, more efficiently, so that we can continue to reduce the tax burden, so that we're competitive and grow, and so ultimately that we can afford the NHS in 10 or 20 years' time. And that's the real choice between Conservatives and Labour. Do we blow this progress in a spending spree, or do we act in a responsible way that grows the economy going forward?
And you said when it comes to tax, anything you do, you said right at the start, will be responsible. You've told your colleagues that the quantum they may want for tax cuts may not be affordable. In the autumn statement, you're absolutely right, you gave very big tax breaks. There was the cut in national insurance, there was that very significant tax break for businesses that invest, all of that worth more than £20 billion a year, a very big tax-cutting package. Are we looking at, say, half that for this budget?
I don't know. And it would be wrong for me to give you any kind of guidance on that, not just because chancellors don't talk about those kinds of things ahead of budgets, because I genuinely don't know, because we haven't, been through the iterations with the Office for Budget Responsibility. But, I do believe that more lightly taxed economies are more dynamic, generate more money for our public services, and enable us to be the country we want to be, which is a very prosperous country with well-funded, efficient public services. And that's what a Conservative government will deliver going forward. And we just say, let's not go back to square one and put that progress at risk.
I've just got a couple of other things I need to talk to you about. One is much more in the consumer space. You've said that you would review the buy now, pay later industry. This is a form of credit for people who are buying in shops. When will we see the result of that review?
Well, thank you for bringing it up. We are doing a consultation on it. It is taking longer than we thought, and I'll explain why. It's because buy now, pay later deals are a lifeline to lots of people. They allow them to buy something that they need urgently and without paying interest, finance it over a longer period of time. And we don't want to stop people doing that who can genuinely afford it. But we do need to make sure there's no abuse for the people who can't. And it is difficult to navigate a path to do that. But that's what we're trying to do. We're absolutely committed to having tighter regulation.
Do you think we'll see the rules before the election? Quite a lot of people around you seem to be saying probably not before the election.
Well, I hope so, but we need to get it right, and that's why we're going through this from every single angle, because we want to make sure that we end up in exactly the right place on this.
A couple of other things. You're a great believer in free trade. Donald Trump has said 10% tariffs on all imports to America. That would be the death knell for free trade. What do you think of that?
Well, we will work with whoever is President of the United States. It's our closest ally, and on the global stage it's very important. But that doesn't mean to say that we would agree with everything an American president does. And I can tell you that
you would be appalled, wouldn't you? You'd be appalled by that, wouldn't you? Appalled by the idea of 10% tariffs.
Well, the United Kingdom does not believe in protectionism. We're the country that, Adam Smith was the first economist to understand the concept of free trade, and we think it's led to a massive increase in global prosperity. So this is not something the UK supports, any kind of move to protectionism.
And finally, what's your advice to Conservative MPs who are plotting to unseat the Prime Minister?
Well, what I would say, Robert, is that there are many fewer of them than the media talk about. Of course, it's a big story if you hear that from even one Conservative MP. The vast majority of Conservative MPs know that we need to be a united team. Divided teams don't get re-elected. This is a general election year. We need to pull together.
Chancellor, very good to see you as always.
Thank you, Robert.
David, so I've got to ask you on this tax-cutting question. I don't know if you saw the so-called new Conservative group of Tory MPs, I think, said only today that they wanted to see £25 billion of tax cuts in the budget. Jeremy Hunt has just said that's not affordable, won't even commit to £10 billion. How are your colleagues going to react?
Well, look, he's right to wait in one respect, because all these organisations we're talking about, from the IMF to the OBR, pop quiz. When was the last time they got a forecast right?
When's the last time anybody got a forecast right? That's not the point. It's direct. It's about direction.
But they did warn against Liz Truss.
Answer never. I mean, Liz Truss got other things wrong in other ways. But Answer never. So you've got to be as close as you can be to do it. Now, I want to see the highest possible tax cuts. Whether it's 25 billion or not, I don't know. But what is clear at the moment is that the way the Treasury, as it were, and the economy set up, is it's generating quite a lot of tax take. The non-indexation of allowances, for example, along with inflation, will drive a lot of money into the Treasury.
What you're saying is the tax burden going up because of the non-indexation creates. But that's, I mean, many would say that's a disaster. You know, for that to happen on your watch.
But he's right, and he's also right to say that, you know, the key here is growth. You were asking earlier about why Labour are not now opposing the removal of the cap on the finance sector. Why? Because they don't want them all to decamp to America. Why? Because it pays half of the cost of the NHS, the tax take there. So the important thing here is growth. He's right about that. You're not going to get much more out of the Chancellor at this point, because he doesn't want to make the Liz Truss quite a mistake.
But it's quite it is quite interesting seeing. So I was just saying, it is quite interesting seeing the Chancellor manage expectations of tax cuts downward, and I suspect the reason for that is he's very worried that if he does bigger tax cuts, Bank of England won't cut interest rates as fast, and that would obviously be a problem for.
But Robert, I think
government.
you made him get away with something right at the very beginning, which you shouldn't have done, where he talked about spending public money responsibly. This government has wasted £100 billion. And really, every single interview, we should be holding their feet to the fire on that. £100 billion, and they've got the cheek to say, well, we want to spend the public money responsibly.
Sorry, I think, because viewers were wondering, when you say 100, I mean, lots of people have got different views about what's been wasted, but where's your £100 billion come from?
Oh, £100 billion from stuff that's wasted through PPE, contracts, what was you going to say, David?
I hate to say this to you, but, you know, I was Public Accounts Committee Chairman who looked over PFI. And the years of PFI, it made even PPE, which I hate, like you.
But Dawn,
but I'm talking about now, and those are figures that the PFI
certainly the waste on procurement during COVID is most people would say is a scandal. But I need to ask you a question about.
But the Public Accounts Committee have got the figures and numbers with all the wastage that this government has wasted.
Waste is
so when they say they're going to
this is legit. This is, you're absolutely right. It's a legitimate point. There was a lot of waste on their watch. But I do need to ask you about what's going on your side, which is we've had Shadow Chancellor backing away from that £28 billion annual commitment for green investment. Surely, again, that is something, a bit like Tory MPs wanting bigger tax cuts. You'll be upset about that, won't you?
Number one, they're not backing away, but what Rachel Reeves has said is we want economic growth, and that's going to drive tax cuts rather than trying to reform the tax system. So that's what Labour is focusing on. That's their main focus. They haven't backed away from the 28 billion. It was made at a very different fiscal time when they made that commitment, but that is still...
Dawn, that is still
a Labour Party commitment.
Come on, I'm going to talk to you both about more of this. We can come back to this in a minute or two. Now, I've also, this afternoon, had a chat with the personal finance guru, Martin Lewis. Obviously, none of ITV's fabulous presenters. Now, he's been campaigning for regulation of the buy now, pay later credit industry that I was just discussing with the Chancellor. I asked Martin Lewis why he thought it was so important to introduce regulation for this industry right now.
Well, look, buy now, pay later is the biggest growing form of debt in the UK. You'll know it's now ubiquitous when you go to pay online. You are offered this spread your payments. It's for a long time been sold as a lifestyle choice. It's not a lifestyle choice, it's a debt. Now, that doesn't mean I'm against it. If you're making a planned purchase and you know that you need to spread the cost over 3 months and you can do it interest-free on buy now, pay later, it can be a really useful function. But what many people do is they do it on impulse. And one of the reasons buy now, pay later is free is because retailers know that customers who shop using buy now, pay later tend to spend more and transact more. And that's the benefit for them because it tweaks their impulse spending nipples to try and get people to spend more. So the whole point about regulation is to say, look, this is a debt. It's massive. Millions of people use it everywhere. It doesn't have the same safety and regulation and protocols as other forms of debt. Stats from Citizens Advice say 30% of people who have buy now, pay later are taking out other borrowing to pay it off. They say 1 in 5 people are missing payments. Those can all cause problems for your credit file. If the buy now, pay later is reporting them to a credit file, they could cause problems for your mortgage. And in itself, missing a payment can be a really bad thing. So what we need is, just like every other form of consumer lending in the UK, we think it should be regulated.
Now,
because if you regulate it, we can...
Sorry, when you were on air with the Chancellor the other day, from memory, he gave a pledge to you and your viewers that there would be regulation.
I'll call it a political pledge. He gave the indication that they had not shelved regulation and they were looking for it and they wanted to make sure they didn't stop innovation. Now, that was, of course, not a political show like yours. That's a mainstream consumer show, 3 million people watching it, the electorate out there, and oh no, we're looking at doing so. So if the rumours that it's being shelved are true, well, first of all, I will be furious, as will Which and Citizens Advice. We all think this should be regulated. We were promised regulation. The regulations were produced. The regulations were consulted on in February 2023, and the only people who seem to be objecting to it is the industry itself.
But if they're
Now, look,
threatening to leave the country, and that means there's less credit available to individuals who want to go shopping, how would you advise the Chancellor to deal with that?
Well, first of all, crocodiles cry tears too, but it doesn't mean they're real. It doesn't mean they're going to leave when they're making profits here. All regulation does is make sure that we control the marketing, and that if something goes wrong, people have a right to go to the financial ombudsman. And if these firms are not willing to allow people to have redress to the ombudsman and to have a little bit of oversight over their marketing, which has been horrendous in some years, where they've encouraged people to borrow as a lifestyle choice, then frankly, we don't want them. So the Chancellor should say to them, look, this is a big market here. You're welcome here if you abide by the rules that others do. And I get that their problem is that the Consumer Credit Act isn't perfect. I agree it isn't perfect. But it isn't perfect for credit card companies either. It isn't perfect for loan companies. We need to get them inside it so that they're regulated, and we need to improve the Consumer Credit Act. But saying that we should have special privileges so that consumers who use buy now, pay later don't have any protections, and therefore we're going to sit on that because the rules don't quite work, doesn't seem to add up to me. I think the Chancellor's first job is to protect UK consumers, and we need proper regulations. Not necessarily all buy now, pay later firms are doing anything wrong, but that's what we do with consumer credit. We regulate it so that people are safe to use it, and they've got decent redress if things go wrong afterwards. Now, and I can't see any reason why the Chancellor or the companies should be objecting to that in the hard court.
Now, I have another big question to put to Martin Lewis, and you can hear his answer after the break. Welcome back. Now, there was one more question I wanted to put to the financial guru, Martin Lewis. It was about what the Prime Minister told Keir Starmer at Prime Minister's Questions today, namely that, this is what Sunak said, he said that when a typical mortgage borrower goes on to a higher interest rate deal, that borrower wouldn't pay any more if they took advantage of the deal with banks negotiated by his Chancellor to extend the payment term and restrict payments to interest rather than principal. I was slightly dubious about the Prime Minister's maths, so I asked Martin Lewis if the Prime Minister was right.
I didn't hear what was said, so going only on what you're asking me.
You can trust me.
Certainly, Certainly, the mortgage provisions that were put in place that I was engaged in last year were for people who were in trouble, and were for people to be able to get some form of, forbearance on the situation that they're in. I mean, mortgages are much more expensive than they used to be. I think trying to argue that if you extend your term, you're not going to pay any more per month. Well, no, but you're going to pay massively more interest over the extended term, that it's some type of equivalent. Well, that simply isn't right. Mortgages are more expensive. The causal reason for why mortgages are more expensive, whether it's the Bank of England, whether it's government policy, whether it's international issues, I will leave to economists. But absolutely, most people getting a new mortgage now are going to pay substantially more when they come off their fix than otherwise. And the mechanisms available, extending your term for an extra 20 years so that you're paying off your mortgage for 20 years longer, I don't think you could say that that makes it perfectly reasonable that you're not paying any more.
I think almost everybody watching will agree with you, which is why I was slightly surprised to hear the Prime Minister making this case. Martin, as always, great pleasure to have you with us. Thanks again.
Thank you.
So I want to pick up with a couple of points, actually, from both of those interviews. First with you, David. I mean, you've taken a close interest in financial regulation for donkey's years. You'll have noticed that every time you buy anything now, before you're allowed to pay, it says, do you want to take out a deal where you don't have to pay immediately? How worried are you by this proliferation of debt under buy now, pay later?
Well, it's a serious issue, as way back when you and I were children, hire purchase was, and of course that got regulated, but not very well. And in that respect, I think the Chancellor's right. You've got to.
But they're moving at a sales. It was like 18 months ago they first said they would.
2021, I think it was.
I think get it right and then do it once rather than get it wrong and do it in a hurry. Is my view. But right enough, I have sympathy with.
But how about not doing anything?
Well,
I don't
think that's true. I don't. That's not what's going to happen. You know,
but since 2021,
and the Chancellor is a cautious man, and he'll want to get it right, and he will. And I'd lay good money to do it before the election, certainly.
Well, he wasn't committing to it, and Dawn if they don't do it before the election, do you think Labour will do it very quickly?
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of the commitments. I think Shadow Minister Tulip was talking about it today and saying to the government that they need to act quickly because it has been since 2021. And not only would we regulate it, the industry want to be regulated. The good buy now, pay later people, they want to be regulated. So there's no reason for the government to be dragging their feet, really.
Industry want regulation because it helps them keep competition out. So let's not get too taken in by that. But the very fact...
But at least they want regulation. It's better than not doing anything,
An almost
David.
cynical view of this is that you're quite right. If the government hasn't done it by the time of the election campaign, it will become an electoral issue. So there's an incentive for them, if everything else is the same, for them to get it done by then, and they will.
Oh, we'll see. Tons more I need to talk to you about. Nushka, though, you've got something you need to share with us.
I have. Former SNP leader Nicola Sturgeon was in front of the COVID inquiry today. There were tears, as she suggested she might have preferred not to be First Minister at the time. She was also asked about missing WhatsApp messages. She argued that she would use different language, that she would talk about not retaining the messages, saying that was in line with government advice and that official correspondence wasn't done via mobile phone. But when pushed, so you deleted them, she did reply yes. But what about the SNP's position in Scotland more generally? As we know, they had a pretty successful election in 2019, winning 48 of Scotland's 59 seats. Labour got just one. But despite that, it would actually only take an 11% swing to Labour for them to become the biggest party north of the border. Maybe it is this fear of Labour that has led to a change of language from the SNP. SNP leader Humza Yousaf has been telling Scottish voters this week that Keir Starmer doesn't need Scotland to win. But previously, our next guest, Stephen Flynn, was saying the SNP would hold the balance of power in a hung parliament. So, who is right? Well, it is true that Labour currently has a lead of more than the 13 to 14% needed to win a general election without winning Scottish seats. But polls usually do swing towards a government ahead of a general election, and anything below that point would need Scotland.
Thanks, Anushka. Now, earlier on, I was talking to Stephen Flynn, who's the Scottish National Party's leader at Westminster. I asked him if he personally was anxious that his former leader, Nicola Sturgeon, had failed to deliver her WhatsApp messages to the COVID inquiry, as the inquiry had demanded, and had that undermined the SNP's claim to have been more honest and straightforward than Boris Johnson's government. Do you remember Boris Johnson's government? I do.
Well, what we've seen through the public inquiry is a fairly forensic level of detail placed upon the actions of Nicola and indeed others throughout the pandemic, and I think...
Which is only right, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's the right thing to do, and it's the right course of action to be taken.
And it's exposed weaknesses.
And Nicola's been very clear that, in her eyes, she was certainly following the policy as she understood it to be the case.
It must drive you bonkers that in the aftermath of the police, what's still going on, the police investigation into the SNP's finances, which many would say has damaged Nicola Sturgeon's reputation, you now get this further level of mistrust introduced because of the disappearance of the messages.
Well, of course, it'll be for people to determine themselves why things happened in the way that they did. But for me and for those people that I've spoken to, what we had was a First Minister who gave every single second of their life to trying to do the best by the Scottish people throughout what was an incredibly challenging time for all of us. Was everything done perfectly? No, I don't think it was. Hamza Yousaf has been very clear about that.
She's always so composed. It was really striking to see her so upset today. Why do you think she was so upset?
It was because of the scale of the commentary that there's been in and around an aspect of, in my view, an aspect of what Nicola did or didn't do during the pandemic in relation to her WhatsApps. And, you know, it was clear to me watching it today that she was obviously deeply emotional. And for me watching that, that was quite challenging, because what you can see there is a person who committed everything they had to trying to do their best by the Scottish people. And now, of course, their judgment's being called into question. That's a difficult thing for it to happen to anyone, but particularly someone who was held, and I think is still held, in very high regard by the Scottish people.
I mean, because of concern in many quarters about, some would say, the ethical shortcomings of those who led your party, your popularity has fallen. Your leader, Hamza Yousaf, seems to now be accepting that Labour will be in government. He's saying that your role is to hold them to account. He used to say you should hold, you would hold the balance of power. Do you accept that Labour is undoubtedly going to win a majority in the general election?
I think perceived wisdom from most people looking at the opinion polls would suggest that Keir Starmer is in all likelihood going to become the next Prime Minister. But what I'm focused on...
So what does that say about your failures in Scotland?
Well, of course, we're not trying to take ownership of Downing Street, because we only stand in Scottish seats. So
no, but you've got 43 MPs out of 59 at the moment. What would be a good result for you in this general election?
So I'm looking to retain every seat that we have, but also to try...
But he seems to be implying you won't.
No, he's not implying that at all. He's implying that Keir Starmer is going to be Prime Minister based upon votes, overwhelming number of votes, which take place, of course, in English...
So you're confident you're not going to lose any seats, even on the basis of opinion polls that show otherwise? You just told me opinion polls show Keir... So you obviously believe opinion polls, and that would show that you're going to lose seats.
What I believe in is the fact that when we go into this general election campaign, which will soon be upon us, we'll be making it clear to the people of Scotland what it is that we believe in. We believe in membership of the European Union. We believe that it's good for the economy. We believe that migration is good for our NHS and for our public services more widely. We believe that it's right that you invest in public services, not continue with Tory austerity. We believe that you should double down on energy investment, the likes of £28 billion in green investment. But we believe the people of Scotland should have a choice over their own future. That makes us very different to the Labour Party. It makes us incredibly different to the Conservative Party, and ultimately be for the Scottish people to vote for what they believe in.
Don't go away, because after the break I'll be talking about Rishi Sunak's planned smoking and disposable vape ban with Dawn Butler and David Davis, and there'll be more from my interview with Stephen Flynn of the SNP. Welcome back. Now, in the last part of my interview with Stephen Flynn, leader of the SNP in Westminster, I pointed to the pressure we've been putting on the Prime Minister to call for a ceasefire in Gaza. And I said that surely he'd be pleased that the Foreign Secretary, Lord Cameron, is saying that Britain should accelerate recognition of a Palestinian state as part of a sustainable new settlement for this troubled region.
I don't think they can move much slower than they already have, the glacial pace throughout this. I mean, what we've seen now over the course of the last 100+
But you must
days,
approve of what Cameron said.
If he delivers upon what he says, then I'll be quite happy with it. Of course I will be, but we are ultimately going to need much more than that, because it's been proven through the ICJ that it's plausible that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. And as a result, what we need is an immediate ceasefire. Now, we hear lots of talk in the House of Commons, both from the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, about getting access to humanitarian aid. That is incredibly important. But the best way to get access to humanitarian aid, the best way to resolve the humanitarian crisis, is to have that ceasefire. And I think it's long overdue for the House of Commons to vote on this again.
The definition of genocide is extraordinarily difficult. We're not going to know the result of that court case for years and years and years. But by contrast, your leader, Hamza Yousaf, gives a little address on Holocaust Memorial Day and somehow forgets to mention Hitler's extermination of the Jews. I mean, that was an embarrassment to your party, wasn't it?
Well, as I understand it, the First Minister was at a Holocaust Memorial Day reception just the other night in the Scottish Parliament, and indeed I seen a tweet from him referencing, obviously, the
But why did he fail in that video to mention the whole point of Holocaust Memorial Day?
Well, I'm very clear, and I've sat the memorial service in London, and I think all of us are very clear about what the Nazis did to the Jews, and indeed what Hamas did to the Israeli state and the Jewish people on the 7th of October, and how utterly appalling and atrocious that is. And anyone in their right mind would condemn that, and they should condemn that, and we can't see that again. Never again, and that needs to be the case, and that's a starting point in all of this. What we're talking about in Gaza is a very different thing. We're talking about the systematic bombing of the Palestinian people in order to root out Hamas, and what we're seeing is civilian casualties as a result. That bombing of civilians needs to end. Children's lives are valuable, and we need to see the UK become clear in their stance that a ceasefire is needed, and it's needed now, and we should have a vote in the Commons to that effect.
Stephen Flynn, as always, very good to see you.
Thank you.
Dawn, I want to talk to you about this issue of a ceasefire. You're very much in favour of one. Are you concerned that your leader, Keir Starmer's refusal to say ceasefire now is costing you important votes?
Keir has says that there needs to be a sustainable ceasefire.
He uses quite different language from you, though, doesn't he?
Well, I think it's taken a bit of time, but for us to be on the same page, using the
Do you think you are on the same page
language.
Okay.
But Keir has said that there needs to be a sustainable ceasefire. There needs to ensure that humanitarian aid gets into Gaza as much as is needed, and that the Palestinian state should be recognised. And I think that's the right thing.
I was quite struck, David. I don't know if you saw Michael Ellis in the House of Commons today at Prime Minister's Questions, and it seemed to me that he was somewhat, I don't know, criticising almost the Foreign Secretary, because the Foreign Secretary has said, as you know, and some regarded this, I regarded this as almost historic, as it were. He said Britain would move towards recognition of a Palestinian state as part of progress towards a sustainable settlement. Michael Ellis decided to go on, well, he can't trust you know, Hamas, it's all too difficult, and it sounded as though he rather disagreed with.
Well, that's for him. I mean, frankly, I thought Stephen was very grudging in what was actually a very material move for a British Foreign Secretary. And let's face it, we are feeling our way to try and find a resolution to the most difficult problem in the world at the moment, you know. And even Stephen said, you know, you've got to find a way of preventing October the 7th ever happening again. Whatever you think about the ICJ's judgment, there is no doubt that torture, rape, murder of children in front of their parents, followed by the murder of the parents, is beyond belief evil. And we have to... And the Israelis... Look, we can all criticise the civilian deaths, of course. But what they're trying to do is eradicate the possibility of October the 7th happening again.
No, and look, nobody wants to see that again. And frankly, you know, the charter of Hamas is toxic, disgusting, you know, wants the elimination of Israel, wants the elimination of Jews. So it's impossible unless Hamas somehow abandons its founding principles to negotiate with them. But nobody can see the scenes in Gaza. You'll have seen, for example, you know, that doctor operating on a child without anaesthetic. These are horrifying scenes.
Yes, no, I agree. And we're doing what we can to get aid in. It's difficult, and we've been trying very hard from the beginning, so have many other Western countries. But, you know, we are facing a circumstance where they won't make agreement over the hostages even. I mean, you know, there looked like there was a deal on the table at one point and Hamas wouldn't have it. So, you know, it's a really, really difficult thing to resolve. I mean, nobody pretends any different.
No, I agree. Now, we just need to change subject briefly because Anushka needs to show us something.
Yeah, you've just got some reaction to your interview with Jeremy Hunt. Christopher Hope from GB News says this is why a second pre-election budget is likely in September, October later this year, as Tory party chairman has suggested. Some people thought that early budget was about a spring election, but actually sources have suggested the same to me. There could be a second budget. Hugo Guy from the iPaper says this is about expectations. He says, looking a bit like supermarket sweeps, suggesting that Jeremy Hunt doesn't want people to get too excited. And I think that Kate Ferguson here from The Sun on Sunday is saying the same thing.
Well, obviously, there's a lot of expectations manager, but I did, as soon as I heard him say what he said about downplaying tax cuts, I did think to myself, well, this is gearing up, you know, if growth improves, to a second budget after the summer to set up the election. Do you think that is their plan?
I don't know whether it's their plan, but it certainly looks plausible. I think both those comments look plausible, to be frank. But you've also got to say he's not just managing political expectations, he's managing market expectations.
Sure.
And if he went out suddenly in your programme, important as you are, and suddenly said, well, despite what the IMF is saying, despite what the OBR is saying, I'm going to have a big tax.
He literally did say that.
Look what would happen to the markets.
Well, sure, certainly interest rates in markets would rise. That would be bad for the government. But Dawn, I need to talk to you now. How anxious should your leaders be that if they do a second budget in the autumn, that will make your position, and they give tax cuts then, that could undermine your position?
I think our Shadow Chancellor is doing a great job in ensuring that the party is fiscally responsible, that everything that we do is costed, and that we're putting people first, the public first, the country first, rather than party. And it's really clear that, the Tories are just putting themselves first. Anything they're doing is just to try and increase their chances of getting more votes so they can try and, win the election. And we're being a lot more sensible than that.
Now, sadly, I'm out of time. I've got to apologise to people because I was going to talk about the smoking ban, but we were distracted by Anushka's sort of investigations on X, the service formerly known as Twitter. That's it. Now, you might not guess that the draw between Aston Villa and Chelsea in the FA Cup has huge political ramifications. It does, because it means next week we'll be on Monday, not Wednesday. You can work out why. Goodbye.